I want to welcome everybody to the Distinguished Seminar Series today. So I'm Lori Pearson, and I serve as the Executive Director of Application Services at OCLC. And I'm really excited about today's presenter, so I'm honored to be able to introduce her. Thank you to everybody in the audience here, OCLC staff and our guests, and to our colleagues and library community members who are tuning in virtually. Today's session is being recorded, and it will be accessible for later viewing on the OCLC website. Past lectures are also available for viewing, along with discussion guides to help facilitate those conversations. We encourage you to ask questions today and to follow the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag OCLCDSS. So OCLC Research established this distinguished seminar series in 1978. It was to encourage the sharing of thought leadership around topics for the ever-evolving world of librarianship and information sharing. We invite our distinguished professionals to our headquarters in Dublin, Ohio, to share the knowledge and perspective with OCLC, to challenge our thinking and to inspire our work. So today's speaker, I'm excited to welcome her. It's Sandy Payette, and Sandy currently serves as the Associate University Librarian at Cornell University. She's held multiple leadership roles in areas of technology and scholarly research, software development, and development of knowledge infrastructures with open source communities, nonprofits, and research libraries. Sandy is the founding CEO of DuraSpace. She led the organization through its startup years and expanded the portfolio of its open technologies that fit within digital knowledge infrastructure. This includes Fedora, DSpace, DuraCloud, Vivo, and adjacent services. Sandy also pursued her PhD at Cornell University, focused in communication and science and technology studies, and she completed her degree in 2018. While working on her degree, she served as a research investigator at the University of Michigan and as a leader in the practice at Cornell University Library. She served in the roles of Director of Information Technology for Research and Scholarship and interim university librarian. Sandy is regarded as a noted technologist and a big influencer in digital library systems, as well as a really strong leader in the area of open source. We are honored to have her with us today, sharing her presentation, Why So Few? The Underrepresentation of Women in Technology and Software Development. So please join me in welcoming Sandy Payette.
Well, good morning, and I'm so happy to be here. So I started at Corning, and that was in the 1980s, and then I moved to Cornell and did most of my career at Cornell in various departments, various colleges, and then I broke away for a while and started up the not-for-profit Fedora Commons, Inc., which is the underlying 501(c)(3) under DuraSpace, and so I was the founding director of DuraSpace. So why so few is a question I kept asking through the journey of that timeline. So I started at Corning. This is me in 1989. I did not smoke cigars. I did run. I was a distance runner. And I don't like pink, but I dug out this photo, and I did have a pink suit on when I was in my short corporate. I was there for 8 years. And basically on the right, you see a photograph of one of our meetings, and 50% women were programmers in my group. That's 50%, even if you see that a couple of people, including myself, were in that collage twice, 50% women were programmers, systems analysts, developers in that group. So that was 1986, 87, 88, 89, at the peak. So if you look at this is This data is well known. You can go to NSF and see it. So this is female occupation percentages for the computing area, okay? So the peak was 1986, 87, 89. That's exactly when I was at Corning. And then you see the slide, and I slid down that entire trajectory. And I didn't slide down in terms of what I did great stuff, but I didn't have colleagues that were women anymore. And that was really interesting. So when I was doing open source software, which was the Fedora era, so I did the original Fedora research at the Computer Science Department at Cornell, and then we open sourced it with funding from the Mellon Foundation. This was the time when I expected that, oh, this will be where women really appear, because open source, it's about freedom, openness, sharing, pro-social ethos. But this, interestingly, was the least diverse period of my being a software developer. However, I had the best tech team. Now, you might know some of these people. These were the original open source Fedora developers that worked with me. There's Thorny Staples, who was my co-director at University of Virginia of the open source era. And then with Michelle Kempton, we led DuraSpace, which was basically open technologies, open source software, Fedora, DSpace, Vivo, DuraCloud, and these were all open source projects that were being used internationally for repositories, knowledge infrastructures. And, you know, there I am in front of the Library of Congress, by the way. So we had great collaborations. And again, this was the best. I loved this period. But I kept thinking, well, where are the women? And this was a question I had. And so in 2011, I passed the reins of DuraSpace to Michelle. And I said, I've been wanting to get my PhD for a very long time. So I'm going to actually take this question up. And I'm going to look at the social implications of the technologies we build. That was my meta topic. And how could I not look at the representation of women in computing and the underrepresentation and take this on as a sociological kind of concern? So I did not go back and study computer science. I studied communication, social sciences, and history of computing, science technology studies. So speaking of history, the first thing I did was look at the history of computing. And I think, when did women start participating? When did they stop participating? So I went back to history as my first move. And if you look at the 1940s, this is a whole lecture I could give, and I would love to give it, but basically in the 1940s, some of the first programmers were actually women. One of the great pioneers of computing is Grace Hopper, and most people recognize her as the founder of COBOL, and she wrote the first compiler for a computer. And the masculinization process that went on through the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, when the microcomputer came out, and notably when the World Wide Web, came to be. And we, see where we land now, Silicon Valley. It's all over the news, the masculinization of tech, the programmer. It's almost become iconic in a way. So, but this is really a social problem. I consider this a social contemporary problem of concern. If indeed computers are in our pockets, on our desks, in our kitchens, everything that we're doing in our digital lives, our digital world, behind it is software and the infrastructure for running it. If there is a diverse group of people that would presumably represent all of the values in the infrastructure and in the software that we as a diverse society would expect to be there. But that has not necessarily been the case. And there's been some interesting research about, basically the social construction of technology and very interesting stuff. But for me, I just said, all right, let's get down to the basics. The design and the development of the technology is really about knowledge and power. And you'd say, well, how did I get to that conclusion? So basically, I thought, okay, I am not tech Sandy. I am, basically now philosophy, social sciences, workplace practice. This is the lens that I'm working with on this dissertation research. So, I mean, I really went back to Foucault, critical theory philosopher, the theory of discourse and power. And, if we just read this one quote of Foucault's, discourse transmit and produces power, it reinforces it. But it can also undermine and expose things, and it can make certain things fragile and thus be able to thwart them. And so this, in terms of thinking about forms of oppression, forms of hiddenness of underrepresented people, this really was kind of a direction that I went in with this research, which seems kind of odd, maybe, to some people who maybe know me more as a technology kind of person. But this was so instructive, and in the end, I became fascinated with this pattern of the transitions from discourse to action to social change. And so I have 3 cases I'm going to share with you today that came from my dissertation research. And there are these themes that continue to emerge: unconscious bias, obfuscation by data, that's a term that I've been using, and occupational identity. So these are 3 themes in the research that really are instructive. So if we think about unconscious bias, I have a little video clip here. This was the Grace Hopper Conference, which is a huge conference for women in technology. I'll talk more about that a little bit later. But here is a clip from a plenary during the days I was doing my dissertation research. This was 2014. And here's Satya Nadella, who's the CEO of Microsoft, Maria Klawe, who's the president of Harvey Mudd College. And so, if we're just wanting to contemplate something for a moment.
For women who aren't comfortable with asking for a raise or sort of saying, who aren't the younger you, let's say, what's your advice for them?
All right, so here's Nadella's answer. And this happened in 2014. So think about this.
It's not really about asking for the raise, but knowing and having faith that the system will actually give you the right raises as you go along. And that, I think, might be one of the additional superpowers that, quite frankly, women who don't ask for a raise have. Because that's good karma. It'll come back. Because somebody's going to know that's the kind of person that I want to trust. That's the kind of person that I want to really give more responsibility to. And in the long-term efficiency, things can...
Okay. So I call that a moment of discourse. And again, my dissertation was using critical discourse analysis as a means of surfacing contradictions, tensions, and looking at paths that could suggest future prospects for social change. So here we have it. So Satya Nadella, he is a good guy. He's a committed male ally. And in fact, he was brought to the Grace Hopper Conference as a male ally, which was the discourse of male allies, male advocates was very present at that conference. So he's a good guy. He's reflective about social justice. If you heard his entire talk, you would think this guy is great. He's advocating for women, he's thinking deeply, and he is great. But he did put his foot in his mouth. So I don't know if you know Kara Swisher. She's a major tech press journalist. Open mouth, insert foot. Microsoft CEO tells women techies to trust karma on pay equity. So what happened here, this went viral. So if you go to the news, and you go to Twitter, and you go back, this was just viral internationally. And I mean, there was, people were shocked, people were, tweeting about it. The press was, mainstream evening news, NBC was talking about it. So what's going on here? So you may have heard the term unconscious bias. It's getting a lot more attention than it used to. The National Academies had a report that you can read online that basically observes a meta-analysis that most discriminatory behavior is in the form of implicit bias. And this results from gender schemas and assumptions that people have based on cultural background that they're not even necessarily aware of. And both men and women have this phenomenon. So it's not just that men have unconscious bias, women have it too. And there's been a lot of research that will show, for instance, that in evaluating candidates, there have been experiments where the same resume and the same materials are presented, and the only thing that you have is a switch of the name to a woman versus a man. And consistently, the research will show that same credentials, the man will consistently be chosen in these experiments. So there's a lot of research on this. I'll point to this book. This is Joan Williams, who's actually a legal scholar at Hastings School of Law, affiliated with the University of California. And she has done research, and she's been looking at this work for years of other people's research. And she has kind of noted that women, in particular, face a particular type of unconscious bias, 4 patterns. She calls these 4 patterns: prove it again, the tightrope, the maternal wall, and tug of war. And so the prove it again theme of the many women that she has interviewed, which is a substantial number of female leaders, the notion that women have to kind of show their legitimacy, prove their competence again and again and again, whereas men will often be given the benefit of the doubt, that women have to walk on a tightrope, essentially, and this has to do with things like language and body language. If women are perceived as too feminine, they're viewed as incompetent. If they're viewed as too masculine, they're viewed as not nice, they're not liked. So there's a lot of research on this, but she does a beautiful job in this book of summarizing it all and then giving women advice in terms of how to deal with some of these things. The maternal wall. Women who have children or are planning to have children are typically receive a particular type of bias. They're perceived as not committed. They're not going to be there for the long haul. Their priorities are not career-oriented. So these are some of the kinds of things that we actually see quite frequently. So what is being done about this? This is where this unconscious bias training. Has anyone heard of unconscious bias training? Okay. So this is a universities, companies, Silicon Valley companies. Cornell has been doing some cool programming with unconscious bias training. But basically, this is kind of the latest attempt to raise awareness about these types of biases that we all have. There's the original research. I would mention that this is Greenwald and Banaji, and the notion of implicit bias as a phenomenon has a deep social psychological kind of roots in academia. There's also, you can actually take a test, implicit association test, IAT. And so, we think, okay, so there's bias. But then there's all this data. Everyone's collecting diversity data, looking at, what we did see, the data was showing the decrease in the percentage of women in tech. So we'd say, okay, well, enough with, the sociological stuff. Isn't data king? I mean, aren't we in the world of big data? Data is going to tell us everything. Algorithms will solve the problem. Well, it depends on what you're measuring. So indeed, if you are measuring women, counting the participation of women in computer science programs, in workforce participation, that type of descriptive data and statistical data and metrics, this is useful. I mean, that's how I was able to look at myself going down that slide in the early slide there and say, what's happening? So yes, this is very useful. And if you look at the bottom right, this is an example of a pattern. Computer science degrees granted from 1996 to the late 2000s. And that's an interesting pattern. You watch as the number of men getting computer science degrees go down. go up, the number of women go down, and the inverse relationship here is rather fascinating. So these are good uses of data to understand these trends. So yes, data is necessary for certain types of baselines of participation, for tracking of trends, and this is good. But yes, critiques of data are also good to say, what is this measuring and what is it not measuring? So we, should aim for better data initiatives, and some of the not-for-profits that are working in this space are actually encouraging that. But let's go and look at Silicon Valley as a case, okay? So there is a tendency in corporations to want to privilege data, privilege metrics, and consider data as a means of not just setting a target, but measuring towards a goal, right? So there was this moment, again, when I was doing my dissertation in 2014, where Silicon Valley companies, for the first time, actually released their diversity data. The top companies. We had Yahoo, Facebook, Google, GoDaddy, Apple. And so here were the percentages. And the key thing that they did, which had not been done before, was go beyond what the EEOC would require. This is, kind of federal policy law kind of stance of what needs to be reported in terms of diversity. So things like professionals didn't really tell the issue. So the Silicon Valley companies actually published a more broken down set of their diversity data to distinguish between tech and non-tech, okay? So if you look at these companies in 2014, we're talking the percentage of women who were in tech, meaning technical jobs, developers, software engineers. We see some numbers like 15% for Yahoo and Facebook. Google, 17%, Apple, 20%. So Apple being, the best of the crew here, still had 20% women to 80% men. So Apple, again, making progress, more so than the peer companies. But still, if you go to Apple's diversity inclusion website, you see some trends, right? And you go, oh, wait a minute. Apple, 38% women. This is great. But then you look at the details here, and you basically see that they're saying 38% women, those are women under 30. So this is good, that their new workforce is more diverse, right? But if we actually go to that page, their web page here, what we see is, this is their diversity inclusion page, and indeed, the narrative here is very pro-social and different together, and all of these testimonials. There's that chart around diversity inclusion. So there's stories, and this is very valuable. Stories help people imagine themselves in different ways. But finally, you do get down to the diversity data at the bottom. And if I go back to, this is an infographic that's active. So 2014, again, that's when I was doing my research. You'd say, oh, it's still 30-70, but no. Let's look at tech versus non-tech. So tech. Okay, there it is again. 80-20, 80% men, 20% women. And so you say, okay, what has happened since then? Well, there's a slight change, 23% in 2016, 23% in 2017, 23% women in 2018. So again, this is, let's get my slides back up, okay. This is, again, the stubborn, stuck percentage, and it's fascinating how even after huge investment in a diversity program, and commitment, it doesn't really budge yet. So we keep thinking, what's going to happen here? So what we saw here is there's a discourse of data going on. So there's a discourse of data because it's objective, it's legitimate, it's measurable, it measures productivity. It measures productivity on diversity programs. Not much productivity going on there, which is kind of sad. So, so where I would like to go with this actually is there is something else going on, and I think it's around occupational identity, and the research, there's been a lot of research on this topic. I would point to Karen Ashcraft at CU Boulder, who has this notion of the figurative practitioner as the notion of a symbolic notion of who fits an occupation and who doesn't. So again, going back to the history, this is really interesting. If we go way back to the 1940s, we see some of the earliest examples of invisibility and exclusion, basically. So this is the original ENIAC. So that you'll hear the term sometimes in the history of computing of the ENIAC girls. So the ENIAC was one of the very first computers in the United States, and the programmers of the ENIAC were women who were initially thought to be coders, as this was perceived to be more of an administrative type of role, to actually code the computer and run the algorithms, that the mathematicians and designers had created. When in fact, to actually do that, it wasn't really understood what running this machine, this behemoth of machine, actually really meant. So these were the earliest days of what programming was actually done with plugs and changing up the wires. But this was programming. This was some of the first early patterns of programming were played out through the plugging and moving of the wires. So then if we move on from there, the Grace Hopper was, again, real icon of the history of computing. She was very dominant for decades, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. And lo and behold, in 1968, she was given this great honor of being the Man of the Year in computing. So if this doesn't make, it was almost unthinkable to not call her the Woman of the Year in computing. It was not an intelligible concept. And that, again, theory of discourse will kind of discuss, this notion of intelligibility. So if Grace Hopper, one of the great icons of programming, was Man of the Year, we think, well, what else, should we be thinking about? So this notion of symbolic occupational identity, where the identity itself of the profession has more resonance than actually any one individual in it. So basically, a profession can be marked. So these familiar images, Guys in Garage, that actually was an advertisement that Garage there, that was American Express doing an advertisement to encourage investment and use of banking. But again, Guys in Garage. There's a book on the bottom left there, Nathan Ensminger, which really is a great history of the transition and the masculinization of computer programming during the 50s and the 60s. He's done some really great historical work. And then, of course, the media, social media, film, you probably recognize those two, so that's Silicon Valley, the streaming stuff you can watch, that basically has this image, the guy with hoodie, the programmer. I don't know how many people have heard about the programmer. So you look at the tech press, you'll see a lot of this. If you just Google this stuff, we're starting to have resonance of these images in the press and critiques of them. So another image, though, is the Grace Hopper Conference. So I attended this conference, and 15,000 women from all over the world in computing and technology. It's Fran Berman, who is she's the chair of the board of directors for Anita Borg Institute, and she calls it, women in tech nirvana. She's actually used that term. And it is, and you've never seen so many things going on in terms of motivating girls, programs for young girls, programs for professional women, networking opportunities, connections to all of the other tech not-for-profits like Lean In, like NC-WIT, like Girls Who Code. So it's a total gathering place. And the vibe and the sense of computing, it's a totally different view that you're getting. But how many people are going to see this view? Well, that Nadella incident that actually went viral and hit the news, that was an effect of the strategy of the program here, which is to get mainstream media attention. So that was just one example where more people learned about women and pay inequity through just that moment of discourse and the aftermath of it than we would have seen in many, probably otherwise. I mean, that was a moment of high resonance. So it's things like this that help us move forward and forge new identities, new symbolic identities that, when people think of a programmer, what do they think of? When people think of an electrical engineer, what do they think of? So the work for this identity work, I'm calling it, it's going on at institutions, academia. There's research in academia that outreach to different communities. There's grassroots coding groups, grassroots meetups. I did during my research, Girls Who Code has meetups, Girl Develop It, meeting in a coffee house and learning to code in Python. I mean, so there is kind of this interesting grassroots movement also going on around this. And so I point to a couple of other social phenomenon that we actually see today. So if we think of the Me Too movement, okay, that's a discursive movement. So the discourse of speaking up has created a movement. So it did move from discourse to action. And the effects of that we're seeing, right now, a very powerful movement. We saw the quote-unquote blue wave. There's been some debate as to whether the midterm elections, whether that was or was not a blue wave. But in fact, the number of women who in the midterm elections were elected to the Democratic Party, that was a very notable thing. So this notion of movements and action is very powerful. And in fact, again, the Grace Hopper Conference, looking at this slide here, hashtag our time to lead. I mean, building the momentum around what's going on right now is very key. And here is what I call the WIT ecosystem. This is the Women in Technology WIT ecosystem of not-for-profits. So again, the Grace Hopper Celebration, that's the Anita Borg Institute, the National Center for Women in Technology, Girls Who Code, Lean In. I mean, these are all very active and doing great work around changing the identity of computing and doing programs. They're basically bridge builders between academia and the corporate world. And they're really working both sides of this, and they're kind of intermediaries in the middle, which is a very powerful structural position to be in. And I think about that actually from the standpoint of social network theory also. They're hubs, very powerful structural position that those types of organizations occupy. But so there are, some concluding thoughts here. There are still challenges. There are many challenges before us still in terms of getting equity in, the participation of women in computing. Getting on par, 50-50, that's a long way off, even though that's where I started when I was at Corning. But it's been a stubborn problem for many, many decades. It is a cultural thing. It's about identities. It's about assumptions. It's about opportunity for not forthcoming due to bias, often subtle bias. Of course, there's many examples of overt bias, but it's the subtle bias that sometimes we don't recognize and the impacts of it. The diversity training programs, I'm optimistic that these things will raise awareness. But there's some concern. If we look at, there's an article in the Harvard Business Review by Dobbin and Califf that looks at 30 years of diversity training programs. And the point they're making is, despite the intent and the investment this has, not turned things in the right direction still. So the actual effect has not been as rosy as we would hope. We don't know if the newer version of diversity training programs might be different, and I certainly hope they are. The unconscious bias training programs that I've seen are very innovative, very engaging, and I do think that the moment is actually right for people to think differently about some of the things that are going on. Again, there's a tension still between the metrics paradigm and the cultural analysis paradigm, and the safe space is just some companies just want to collect my data and, let's do data. But the work of the cultural reflection, analysis, and how to not only enable culture change, but measure culture change. Measuring culture change is not an easy thing to do. And so in some way, having a sense of, if you try to measure justice, it's kind of like that. You have to measure it differently. And those of us who think this way are, again, trying to get that message out of how do you measure these social value issues. But there is progress. So again, the younger generation is really shifting the discourse, okay? Identities at large, there's a lot of discussion about identities, and the concept of the identity of the programmer, the identity of the technology person is actually shifting, and some of the programming coming out of those not-for-profits are, the programming is quite impressive. So male allies. So the Satya Nadella clip that I showed, that's important because male allies are essential. I mean, half the population, if only half the population is working on the interventions, that's not good. The whole population needs to be working on the interventions. So women and men together need to solve a social problem of this nature. So encouraging male allies, embracing them when they make themselves visible, available, and working together, I think is essential. And again, institutional policy and individual agency, that's kind of the old structure of institutions, agency of individuals. These kind of feed each other. They're kind of, forces that are kind of constitutive forces in terms of change. So libraries and memory institutions. So this is a really interesting space because, in fact, if you look at the ARL data, research libraries in particular, but all libraries, I looked at the research libraries, the actual percentages are better than tech, Silicon Valley, the corporate sector, and that's encouraging. I mean, that's very encouraging. I did my work there in memory institutions, cultural institution context. One would say, well, why is this? Is it that the whole community is more open to reflecting about these things? It could be. I mean, this is an actual thing I would like to do more work on, understanding the differences between these different sectors and what can we learn from libraries and memory institutions. DLF, Digital Library Federation, has taken a notable social justice turn from its earlier years, and that's quite interesting. So a lot of these types of discussions happen in forums such as DLF. And, to just summarize here, I want to work to change the voice of tech. I want to work with other people who are doing that. And I, again, would encourage anyone who's interested in this to actually attend the Grace Hopper Conference. There's a little kind of pitch for GHC 2019. I didn't see a lot of representation from libraries and cultural institutions when I was there, which was really quite interesting. And again, the NC-WIT organization has a whole library of resources on all of the research that is related to this whole topic. Very valuable stuff, so I direct you there. And at this point, I'd just like to thank you and open this up for questions. So I will, at this point, I understand that there is, instead of a line where you go up to ask your question in a microphone, there is what I would call a football, but it's, so you can actually throw to each other the microphone. I'm fascinated by this. So I will take questions right now, and someone can throw the microphone first. Thank you.